thank you all for being here, and most of all, thank Matt Makoviak, who runs a Republican political consulting firm and who worked in the Bush administration, and so he and I probably seldom voted for the same people. Although there's a chance that on one occasion we might have. And instead of me banging on and on, I want to ask you a very simple first question.
Sure.
How'd you get into politics? Oh, by the way, he's here to root for Texas in the Texas USC game. So, how'd you first get into politics, and what drew you to the Republican Party?
Yeah, it's great to be with you all here. I'm always reinvigorated when I come to college campuses, and I'm delighted the Unruh Institute has such a great reputation. So I'm really delighted to be here, particularly with someone with as much experience and as good a reputation as Bob has. For me, I was at University of Texas. I grew up in Austin, went to University of Texas, and I was there at a very interesting time, right in the middle of the 2000 presidential election. And so living in Austin, being a student at the University of Texas at the time when the sitting governor of Texas was running for president, who also lived in Austin, and then being, in the rain on election night in 2000. Bob, I know this is a difficult memory for you to some extent, but
I didn't mind election night. I minded the Supreme Court.
Yeah, night. A month later, or 2 months later. But I'll tell you, at that age, at your age, when I was sitting there in the rain that night, I felt like I was in the middle of living history. And as a student, as a young person, you probably rarely feel like you're in those kind of moments personally. And I really felt drawn to politics at that time. I really kind of missed the early sort of Bush train because I was too young. I didn't work on the first presidential campaign. I didn't work on his gubernatorial campaigns. I was a student, so I basically switched my major, got out of journalism, got into political communication in the communication school, interned my last semester during the legislative session. We have an every other year part-time legislature, so I worked there my last semester. Was working for someone who had been Karl Rove's first employee at Rove and Company in Austin. Impressed her enough that she, although she denies this, says I know she helped me sort of get into the mix in the Bush administration. So I left the day after graduation with no job, went to DC, had gone up there for spring break as well and pounded the pavement, got my resume out there, figured out how the city was sort of wired, and applied for an appointment in the Bush administration. And about 6 weeks later, I was working at the Department of Homeland Security, doing communications, got an interim security clearance, and was on my way.
And that takes you to consulting.
Yeah, it's a long road. I mean, it kind of depends on what industry you're going to go into. My guess is you all have interest in political science and government and campaigns and public policy. And so the world we live in today is very different, perhaps from the world when Bob was your age, in the sense that you're going to have 15 or 20 employers probably throughout your career. My dad had 2 employers throughout his career. And so if you looked at my resume, in a lot of industries, you might say, boy, this guy's got, this guy doesn't stay in one place very long. In politics, that's actually very common. So I worked in the Bush administration at the Department of Homeland Security for about 1.5 years. I went and worked in the field for Bush Cheney 04 in the re-election campaign in Iowa. I went out and managed the second largest county in Iowa, Lynn County in Cedar Rapids. Was there for the last 4 months of the election. Came out of that, went to the White House and did advance for both the president and vice president for about 10 months in 2005. But at that time, I really wanted to be a press secretary. I wanted to take my communications experience. I really enjoyed following the media, Washington Press Corps, reading daily journalism, and I really wanted to sort of be at the intersection between media and politics. And so it took me a while to find a press secretary opening. I had sort of enough experience to get the interview, but maybe not enough experience to get the job I wanted. But about 10 months later, I got a job as a press secretary for a U.S. Senator from Montana named Conrad Burns, and I started working for him. He was in the middle of the Abramoff scandal, all that stuff happened before I got there. He was up for re-election.
Probably don't know about Abramoff.
Yeah, lobby scandal. I mean, D.C. was the Wild West in the late 90s, early mid-2000s. People going to the Super Bowl with lobbyists, none of it being disclosed. I mean, 22-year-old kids, doing things they shouldn't be doing favors for lobbyists and getting, big perks out of it. That stuff, I really don't think it happens anymore. There's real strict penalties now, and they're much more strict about really tracking down on that. But you had a couple of Republicans, I think a handful, that were enmeshed in that whole Abramoff scandal. It had to do with Native American Indian tribes, lobbying, spending a lot of money. But anyway, it was a great experience, Bob. As you know, in communications, crisis communications is the most valuable experience you can have. It's kind of miserable while you're doing it, but when you're tested by fire, it's very valuable. And I was there 14 months. That entire experience was crisis communications from the entire time I was there. The 5th day I was there, front page story in all the newspapers that he was being about the Abramoff scandal, and it named Bob Ney of Ohio and Conrad Burns of Montana and a couple other members. So, it was an absolute crisis from the very beginning. And he was up in cycle re-election. 2006 was an absolutely brutal election year for Republicans. Democrats took over the House and the Senate. That was when the Iraq War was very unpopular. You had the Mark Foley Page scandal.
Do you guys know what that is?
Yeah, it's about what it sounds like.
Conservative Republican
yeah.
Congressman from South Florida who had, how shall we put it, inappropriate interactions with young male pages.
Yeah, I mean,
it led to the ending at that time of the Page program.
Which is really sad because, it was kids your age that would go to DC for a semester, would have a great experience. They're on the House floor, on the Senate floor. Page duties aren't super substantive, but you talk about living history. Imagine being on the floor when Obamacare passes or whatever major legislation is going on. It's a real shame that ended, and they had studies while they were there as well. But anyway, so I came out of that experience, he lost by 3,000 votes in 2006. I was a little bit down. I felt like by the time I'd been there a year, I really kind of finally knew what I was doing on the Hill, and I felt like that was a real shame. And it was a very tough time to find work as a Republican operative. There weren't a lot of new members coming in. I think Bob Corker won in 06, but other than that, it was really tough to find freshman members. So I went to a PR firm, worked there for 4 months, hated it. That doesn't mean you'll hate a PR firm, but I hated it. And was asked to be press secretary for K. Bailey Hutchison, my senior senator from Texas, who was in leadership at the time as the 4th ranking Republican. So that was a different experience. That was national press. It was all positive. I traveled the state of Texas a lot with her. We had a lot of fun with the VP speculation in 2008 with McCain. Came out of that.
She might have been a better choice than Sarah Palin.
She would have been a far more credible choice, undoubtedly. 3-term senator, member, been on armed services, very credible. She's now our U.S. ambassador to NATO. So, anyway, long story short, Bob, came out of that and decided I really wanted to sort of work my way back to Texas, and I wanted to start consulting. I wanted to start helping candidates. So I launched my consulting firm after I left Senator Hutchison's office, and I've been doing races all over the country and corporate communications consulting since then.
Right. So I want to get to the elephant in the room.
Yes.
If I may.
This is the UT-USC 2009 Rose Bowl. Is that what we're talking about?
This is
even more controversial.
This is a
Donald Trump. Yeah.
True elephant. How do you think Trump is doing? And how about the debt ceiling and DACA deals with the Democrats?
Yeah, it feels like we've entered a different chapter here in the last week, doesn't it? And look, I mean, how is Trump doing? It's a complicated question. It has a complicated answer. I think he has done about as much as he can by himself to follow through on the promises he made as a candidate. Pulled out of TPP, right? Pulled out, approved the pipeline projects, begun renegotiations of NAFTA, put a conservative on the Supreme Court, appointed a conservative cabinet, has used the Congressional Review Act to pull back regulations. There's a lot of things he's done by himself. The problem with that is that these executive actions aren't lasting. And we've all been reminded of that because Obama used a lot of executive actions, and some of the things Trump has done is roll back those executive actions. And so, look, he has had a steep learning curve. He's the first president of the United States in our country's history not to have government or military experience. I'm absolutely convinced he thought this job was more powerful than it really is, easier than he's found it to be. I don't believe he thought the media would be as combative towards him as it's been, and he's brought a lot of that on himself. I don't believe he really understands the relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and how that works. And honestly, the average person doesn't really understand that. But you would hope a person running for president, does understand that. And I think he's quickly learning that. So where are we? I mean, look, we are in historic times. His approval rating is historically the lowest, certainly of the modern era, in the mid to high 30s. He has a solid base of support that is with him no matter what. I mean, one of the things he said in the campaign, the line about walking in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shooting someone and his people would still be with him, it's kind of, an outrageous statement, but it's also kind of feels true, doesn't it? His people are with him almost no matter what. I think he's testing that now. The debt ceiling deal to me, I thought was interesting for a number of reasons. That obviously is a deal they cut last week. I thought it was a good thing because it clears the decks to allow them to move tax reform beginning this month. And so that was, I think, the most defensible strategic reason to do it. What concerns me about it is that he undermined his own Treasury Secretary in the room with the Democratic leaders. You have the Treasury Secretary saying it's not good for the markets to look at our economy and not know whether we're going to be able to pay the bills related to Harvey relief because we're doing a 3-month extension of the debt ceiling. And so he basically overruled his own Treasury Secretary. Now, I think what's pretty clear about Trump is he wants wins. He's not consumed by what those wins are. He's not ideological. He's not, he doesn't know the details really on most issues. He wants to be seen as getting things done, seen as getting victories, seen as making things happen. And if you look at his negotiating and business experience, I think that's pretty consistent. The problem is that members of Congress do care about whether the wins are worth something. They are ideological. They do have substantive ideas. They have things that they've been working on for a very long time. So on the debt ceiling, look, 6 months from now, nobody's going to care that there was a 3-month delay of the debt ceiling. What's going to matter is, and I think we're starting to see this maybe with DACA, is what did that negotiation lead to? And the fact that you had Schumer and Pelosi in the White House last night for dinner and this semi-announcement shows that Trump now believes he can do business with them. And I understand Trump's frustration because Republican Congress has gotten nothing has no major accomplishments after 8 months. And that's a deeply frustrating fact for Republicans. We have control of the House, control of the Senate, control of the White House. We've been working to get to this point for 7 years. We're now there, and it seems like we can do nothing. And so what does this mean going forward? Look, we could be entering this period where Trump is going to start doing deals with Democrats. The question is, will he be able to hold Republicans? This deal that was sort of announced last night isn't even all that, we don't even know the specifics yet. Sounds like it's allowing the Dreamers to stay, getting rid of any doubt about deportation in the future, and then not doing a wall but doing border security. Now, you've seen conservatives express a lot of anger about that. I don't think the Democrats were ever going to give in on a wall, on anything that could be called a wall. And I actually don't necessarily think the DACA deal is a bad deal, because I think DACA itself is pretty popular, broadly speaking. I think that even conservatives feel like people that came here as children when they were minors didn't have control over where they were being brought, whether they were being brought legally or illegally. And in our system of justice, we evaluate minors differently than we do adults. But so anyway, it's a long answer to your question, but
it's kind of like, isn't it, like Trump, and I'm sure he would be appalled by this comparison, on DACA got back to a kind of George Bush-like position. I mean, when George Bush and Ted Kennedy and John McCain together were trying to do immigration reform.
Immigration reform, prescription, drugs, Medicare Part D, there were Part B. There were actually a lot of bipartisan deals that Bush was able to do, and he did it through building legislative relationships. The political environment. Look, Trump got elected in an extremely divisive election. He has a lot to do with that. There's a lot of blame for that. He failed to seize an opportunity to unify the country when he got elected. The inauguration speech was divisive. His early actions were divisive and not well thought out, the travel ban being a perfect example of that. I thought it was a terrible mistake to bring Steve Bannon in the White House. I thought that sent a terrible signal. What's so strange about this moment we're in, Bob, is that generally politics is about addition, not about subtraction. It's about growing your support. You start with building a base, and then you build out from that base, and you over time try to figure out how far you can go while the base stays with you. he seems, or at least to this point, has seemed perfectly content to have 35% of the country supporting him. That's a problem for Republicans running for re-election next year. We don't want to lose the House. Obviously, we fought very hard to get the House. You lose the House has subpoena power, the committees have subpoena power. The House could impeach Trump very quickly on a majority vote. I mean, it can really get bad for Trump and for the Republicans. So, but you're right. I mean, I think, look, Trump is not ideological. He's not partisan. He's not a longtime Republican. He doesn't care much about the Republican Party. He saw it as the easiest and most available vehicle for him to advance an agenda that he's been fairly committed to ideologically for 30 years, right? Restrictionist on trade, restrictionist on immigration, tax reform, and then this Obamacare issue, sort of isolationism. Those are kind of his 5 core issues. So what's going to be interesting to me is this question now of, how much leeway do Schumer and Pelosi have? So far, they haven't had to give up anything. This idea that Trump's a great negotiator may have been true in business. I haven't seen it yet legislatively because he isn't getting anything of value that I've seen.
It's one thing of value with the DACA deal. He doesn't do something else that's profoundly unpopular in the country.
That's true, and that's a fair statement. Not doing things that make your situation worse, I guess you could call a positive. But in any negotiation, if you're giving something up, you should be getting something in return. And so if Trump is going, Trump or the vice president or his legislative affairs director, Mark Shorter, is going into the Republican conference trying to sell this DACA deal, they're going to say, well, what are we getting for it? And so if the answer is, they're going to have to get pretty specific on border security. Look, we were never going to build a 2,000-mile wall with Mexico. It would be enormously expensive. If any of you, I know in Los Angeles, you guys understand the border here like we do in Texas. In parts of Texas, you have rivers that the border is literally in the middle of a river. You have the Davis Mountains that are 4,000 feet in the air. You can't put a wall in those areas, and really you don't need them in the really rugged rural areas, or even if you cross the border, you'd have to go 50 or 75 miles to get to a community. But I do think the way to move forward is to expand border security in the urban areas. We've seen that in the San Diego sector that Duncan Hunter was very involved in, former Congressman Duncan Hunter, whatever that was, 10 years ago. So that may be a way to find a way forward. Maybe we don't call it a wall, we call it much stricter, much more visible, double-layered border security in urban areas. I think that's something Texas, at least Republicans, and perhaps even some Democrats could get behind. In 2006, people forget this. I forget the number, but the Secure Fence Act, I was working in the Senate at that time. The Secure Fence Act passed, and it had a certain number of miles that had to be built, and you had Democrats vote for the Secure Fence Act.
Hillary Clinton voted for it.
Hillary, Pelosi, Dick Durbin, the number 2 Democrat, Chuck Schumer, I can't even remember. All these people voted for it. So, and Democrats like to say that they are in favor of border security. They say they're against a wall. So obviously the definition is what matters here. And of course, the other thing I'll just mention on this is, we always hear the word amnesty get thrown around as a pejorative when we talk about immigration issues. And one of the difficult things about that word is it's a little bit on the eye of the beholder. Steve King has a certain idea of what amnesty is.
Congressman from Iowa.
Hardline, yeah.
Who said that young Mexican immigrants had calves like
cantaloupes. Yeah, he said some pretty
watermelons because they had all been drug mules.
Yeah. He said some pretty extreme things over the years. He's a hardliner on immigration. But my point is, a hardliner might have a certain view of what the definition of amnesty is, while maybe the majority of the country might think that something along the lines of what Rubio was proposing, whenever that was 4 or 5 years ago, learn English, keep a clean record, pay a fine, wait a certain period of time. Amnesty to me is forgiving someone with no repercussions for what they've done, right? And so you can make an argument, well, paying a fine, waiting, learning English, doing a certain number of things, whatever those things are, is in a way sort of paying for that first act. So, but you're going to see the word amnesty get thrown around quite a bit here. I think fundamentally this is a good deal because I think it'll be popular. Number one, broadly speaking. Number two, it prevents Trump from being put in a position where the DACA program expires in 6 months, and he's faced with either extending it, which he's basically said is unconstitutional, or putting Dreamers in a position where they have no status. Maybe they can't get their work permits extended. Then there's a question of, can they work? Can they go to school? So, you have a situation where by March 5th, if they didn't have a deal that kind of solves this issue, it could have gotten worse. So I think it's a positive thing for the country that they have a deal, but obviously we've got to see what the specifics are.
So what you describe is a Trump who, at least arguably, might be a little more strategic than we think, even though he acts out of frustration, cares about wins. So he does this DACA deal, he does the debt ceiling deal, he keeps talking about Nancy and Chuck. He meets with Tim Scott in the White House yesterday to talk about his response to Charlottesville. And then today, went up and said, on the heels of all this, I was right that there was, on both sides, there were good people in Charlottesville. And you know how you know that? Because of the Antifa movement. This is a strange way to run a White House.
Yeah, he's extraordinarily undisciplined, and you would think that at this point he would realize there's literally nothing he can say about Charlottesville that will make it better. Number one, he's not capable of communicating in a way that would make it better, and the risk of going back to that subject is pretty significant. I think he's one of these people that doesn't take criticism well. And he's gone 30 years of his life in New York in the tabloids, operating off of the idea that if someone hits me, I'm going to hit back twice as hard, to try to make it a disincentive for the next person to take a shot at me. The problem with that is, in politics, you're never going to get to a point, particularly in the President of the United States, where you can convince people not to attack you. Half of the people in Washington are always going to be attacking the other side. And Trump makes it easier to attack him than most presidents do. He did say he liked some legislation that Tim Scott is proposing that they talked about. But when he gets criticized, he feels very defensive. He really wants to defend his views. He always feels criticism is unfair. And so that side of him kicks in, and he really cannot regulate it. And it puts him in a position where he ends up making it worse than it would have been all along.
Yeah, I can't think of a Republican or Democratic president that he in any way resembles.
Right.
And if you think about sort of defining presidencies, FDR, JFK, Ronald Reagan, these were people, and these are people who set a very, very high standard of how they talk to the country.
Yep.
And yet the country understood them. They didn't have to use 140 characters. In fact, you can't imagine any of them using 140 characters.
No.
And they didn't talk down to people. And people like Bush and Clinton and Richard Nixon all aspired to that kind of standard, even if they didn't meet it. So I think there's a possibility that what he's doing is degrading the office of the presidency. And instead of doing what FDR and Kennedy and Reagan did, which was enlarging America's vision and conception of itself, he's actually tarnishing it. And that aside from any individual given bill, that's a really big reality in our politics and our history.
Yeah, I think that's right to a certain extent. If you step back for a second, you just get analytical about it. What are the best moments of the Trump presidency so far? I think you can come up with a few, actually. Number one, I think I guess it wasn't technically a State of the Union, the joint session address I thought was very good. Number two, the announcement, the rollout of the Supreme Court nominee was actually very good as well. And you saw really almost no opposition, no real opposition to Justice Gorsuch. Number three, he gave a great terrorism speech in Riyadh on his first foreign trip after he went to Jerusalem. Very good speech.
But he did not say Islamic radical
yeah, right.
terrorism.
He had been...
Which would have been a little tough in Saudi Arabia.
Would have been, and I think that was, the influence of General McMaster and other people, I think, was having an effect. I thought he gave a great speech in Germany a few months ago that was very good. So, do I think that's risen to the level of what you described with JFK and Reagan and et cetera? No. But I think it shows that with discipline, with focus, with preparation, he can rise to the moment and have very good moments. Has he had enough of them? No. Has he unified the country? No. I think he's handled Harvey and Irma reasonably well. Now, is he managing every aspect of the recovery? No, but I think he's done well going down to those areas. I think he set the tone. His cabinet's performing very well. So the problem is that you're not always going to be as prepared in a moment on Air Force One when you're asked a question or in a meeting with leaders on Capitol Hill as you are for a set piece major speech that you're giving somewhere. So look, we're in a really weird moment in politics here. We really are. I don't know where this is headed. It's entirely possible he doesn't finish his first term, depending on what the Mueller investigation ultimately finds.
So let's say Mueller finds something and he fires Mueller. How do Republicans react to that?
So actually, he literally can't fire Mueller. There's a very prescribed process. Only the Deputy Attorney General can do it, and he can't just do it for no reason. It has to meet certain standards. So I actually think the likelihood of firing Mueller is pretty low. But I do think they are trying to undermine him right now, and they're certainly trying to undermine Comey because I think they think he's going to be a witness. So we'll have to see where the Mueller investigation goes. I do think it's concerning. I think they're focusing more and more on financial aspects, and who knows what the finances have been. I think a number of individuals have big problems. I think Michael Flynn has huge problems. I think Paul Manafort has huge problems. Is that enough to force him to resign? No. I think to me the standard is he directly implicated or is his son Donald Trump Jr. implicated? That could take it to a different level where he has a different calculation. If he were to pardon Paul Manafort or Michael Flynn, that I imagine would be very unpopular, and we might be into a new phase. So that's obviously a huge variable that no one knows exactly where that's headed or how that's going to go. I suspect that Mueller is going to bring a reasonable case to a grand jury and receive an indictment. The threshold to actually get an indictment is pretty low. The other side doesn't present evidence, doesn't have discovery, and that's going to be huge news, obviously, depending on exactly who else is implicated. But so number one, look, based on the way that ends, we don't know where this is headed. There's a scenario where he doesn't finish the 4 years. I think he probably does finish the 4 years. Right now, Bob, I think it's probably more likely than not that he chooses not to run for re-election. I think that he's not enjoying the job. I think he realizes, as I said before, it's not as powerful as he thought it was. I think he's kind of tired of the constant barrage of negativity from the media.
And he keeps Secret Service for the rest of his life anyway, and he has his own
goes back to a pretty good life. Yeah, and he can say, listen, I tried to change the swamp. They wouldn't help me, But the question will be, what does that do to the party, the Republican Party, for that election cycle, right? I imagine he would be if he chooses not to run for re-election, it's going to be because he doesn't believe he can be reelected or because he doesn't want to serve another term. But if it's the former, he's probably so badly weakened that it would make it very difficult for a Republican to win. Certainly, maybe difficult for Vice President Pence to win. So. That said, look, a lot of us didn't think he was going to win the first place. And is there a scenario where he could win re-election in 2020? I think there is a scenario where he can win in 2020. We don't know yet. We don't even know what's going to happen in 2018 yet. The nightmare scenario for Republicans is if the Democrats take the House back, which I think is a plausible scenario. I think it's probably slightly less likely than likely right now, but it certainly is a plausible scenario. As I said before, they can begin impeachment proceedings. They have subpoena power. His agenda gets shut down immediately. The Republican agenda gets shut down immediately. And that consumes the final 2 years of his first term. And depending on how they play it, that could make his numbers go down even further. So, but could he get reelected? Sure. If people feel like he's delivering on his promises, if the economy improves, which tax reform is going to be integral to that. If he's able to do some other deals on some other issues. One of the interesting things about immigration, Bob, and Lindsey Graham, I think, said this. I can't remember who it was. They said he kind of compared Trump to immigration as he compared sort of Nixon to China, in the sense that only Trump could perhaps have the credibility on the right and with the Republican Party and with the conservative voters to try to put a big immigration deal together. And that may be the case, and DACA may be the sort of canary in the coal mine on that. I mean, keep in mind, DACA only affects 800,000 Dreamers. Now you have some parents that are able to get in with that too, so we'll have to see how that affects them. There's something like 3 million of them, family members that are impacted. But you have 11 or 12 or 13 million undocumented people that are here. You have 3/4 of them are not going to be affected by whatever's done on DACA. So that issue still has to be dealt with. And so the question is, if they do a deal on DACA, and if it can get through both the House and Senate, which I think are still big questions right now, does that lead to a bigger deal on immigration? I mean, let's think about where we are if that happens in the first Trump term, right? I mean, that is.
He got the immigration reform that Bush was trying to get.
Sure.
McCain and Ted Kennedy.
Yeah, that Bush tried.
You think it's conceivable that Trump would actually go for that?
Look, I think right now he is so frustrated with Republicans. I think he sees that the path they're on is not going to lead him to a good place, and he's not that committed to them to begin with. He's not that committed to the Republican Party and to its ideals and to its platform. And so, honestly, I think he feels like the last 10 days have been some of the best days of his presidency, partly because of the recovery efforts and how that's been seen, but also the debt ceiling deal played well. And although he's getting a lot of grief today on the far right over the DACA deal, certainly in the mainstream media, it's going to be something that's seen very positively, and certainly very positively in the broader public. And so I think he's very torn right now because he has individuals inside the administration, Stephen Miller and Peter Navarro and people like that are trying to push him in the direction of the agenda he ran on, Steve Bannon from the outside. But his instincts, I think, are telling him, I need to do deals wherever I can. And right now, if you're Schumer and Pelosi, they're not even dealing with McConnell and Ryan, right? I mean, they're going straight to Trump and talking to him. And of course, Trump doesn't have all the specifics and all the details, doesn't know all the history, doesn't know whether something can get whipped and passed in the House or Senate, doesn't necessarily know how it's going to play. And so Schumer's coming in and buddying him up and telling him, listen, this is going to be popular, it's going to help you, it'll help me, it's win-win. And Trump is sort of going along with it. So, if I'd been here.
So what do Republicans in the Congress really think of Donald Trump?
Well, I think that privately a lot of them express concern. There's no question about that. I mean, look, the challenge here, and you understand this better than anybody, Trump is still very popular among Republican voters. I mean, he has 80% or so support among Republicans. So if you're an individual member of Congress, an individual Republican senator, you actually have very limited ability to criticize the president without it hurting you politically. And so until that 80% is dislodged from Trump, Republican members of Congress are going to be very wary of criticizing Trump. You've had a few people that have done that. Lindsey Graham has done that at times. Bob Corker from Tennessee has done that at times. Ben Sass of Nebraska, who I think has a bright future and is a really smart guy, does it more often than most. But those examples have been more limited. But I wouldn't say it's all negative. I mean, I think if you talk to members of the House, they actually thought Trump was pretty helpful when they tried to pass the Obamacare repeal replacement, that Trump was working all hours on the phone, engaging, bringing people to the White House. Did he understand every aspect of the bill? No. But he was absolutely engaged. In the Senate, look, I think in the Senate, I divide them. In the Senate, I think Republicans view him really, really negatively. They think he's doesn't understand the substance, isn't disciplined, causes problems for them, doesn't help them move an agenda.
And he dislikes Mitch McConnell, and he's made it quite clear.
Yeah, and look, I mean, they're just very different. I mean, they're very different people. I mean, almost every adjective you would use to describe Trump, the exact opposite of that word is a word you would use to describe McConnell, right? McConnell is extremely strategic. We don't know necessarily if Trump is or not. Sometimes it seems like he might be, sometimes it seems like he's not. More than anything, McConnell is extremely disciplined. Watching an interview with Mitch McConnell is awful. If you ever have insomnia, I'd encourage you to try it. He never.
Listening to a speech by Mitch McConnell will even.
He never says anything that causes a problem, because he never wants anyone to know something that he doesn't want them to know, and he's disciplined enough. You know, normally when you're being interviewed, you kind of want to sort of seek the approval of the person you're with. You want them to feel good about the interaction. You want them to feel like you're answering the questions. You maybe want to make a little bit of news. He doesn't have those inclinations. He's sort of there to do the absolute bare minimum. If he has a message to communicate, he'll communicate it. Otherwise, he's going to give you the absolute bare minimum. That's obviously not the way Trump is. McConnell's very committed to the Republican Party. He knows that the numbers matter. You know, I think the single most unpopular thing Trump has done in the Senate was single out Dean Heller over the senator from Nevada over his initial opposition to the Obamacare repeal replacement. I mean, Dean Heller is one of two truly vulnerable Republicans in 2018. And we lost a very close Senate seat last cycle in 2016 in Nevada. It's a very tough state. It's a Hispanic majority state. And not only did he single him out and say some things about him, but then the closely aligned outside group that supports Trump's agenda ran $500,000 or $1 million in ads in Nevada criticizing Heller. I can tell you that is extremely, that's something that Senate Republicans view very negatively. So it's an awkward time because generally members of one party and the president of that party, they may have some disagreements, they may have some frustrations, but generally they're on the same page, they're pulling in the same direction, they're working closely together. I think Trump has some members he works with more closely than others, but it's a bit of a frayed relationship, particularly with leadership right now.
My guess is he gets along a lot better with Chuck Schumer than he does with Mitch McConnell.
You know, he might, and listen, if you're not ideological, then you don't necessarily walk into it thinking Schumer is, you know, worse than McConnell, right? He sees both of them as a way to get things done. He tried McConnell's way, and even on things where they had a majority threshold by using reconciliation, they didn't get health care done. Doesn't look like they're going to this year. They have till September 30th, and it sounds like the most recent version is not even going to be able to be scored by September 30th. Tax reform, I think, still is 50-50 this year, so maybe that gets done. But I think, look, the problem here is those are the only two issues that you can use reconciliation on. And so anything else...
understand reconciliation. It's part of the budget, so-called reform that was passed in the 1970s, a lot of people now regret, that says when you're reconciling the numbers for the budget, that as long as you're not increasing federal spending,
Yep.
you have to decrease it, or hold it even. You can pass something by 50 votes,
Yeah.
or 51 votes in this case 50 votes because Pence would break the tie.
Yeah.
In the Senate,
Majority threshold.
yeah,
So.
instead of requiring 60 votes, which other legislation does, and if they can't score, and that means the Congressional Budget Office can't come up with an estimate of the impact of this latest, there are actually two of them, Republican health care proposals. One is bipartisan, one's Republican. Then you can't even vote on it.
Right.
Because you don't know whether it increases or decreases the deficit.
Right, and so keep in mind, the reason this matters is there are 52 Republicans in the Senate, you need 60 votes. It's hard to imagine anything right now, certainly 2 weeks ago, this was more true maybe than today, but anything that can get 8 Democratic votes in the Senate. Now, the DACA deal may be able to, the debt ceiling deal did. That's part of the reason why I think Trump did the debt ceiling deal, is that he had to get 60 votes in the Senate for whatever it was going to be. And so giving the Democrats what they wanted, going against Republicans, knowing he remains popular with Republican voters, I think he may realize, look, I'm not going to jeopardize Harvey funding, I'm not going to jeopardize military pay, I'm not going to have this consume the rest of September. I'm going to focus on tax reform, and we're going to do something that can pass with 60 votes in the Senate. So that to me tells me where we're headed. I mean, where we're headed, I think, is for bigger bipartisan deals. Now, the question is, are they going to have to start giving something to Trump on some of these issues? And will Democratic members of the House and Senate go along if they have to sacrifice something? Because, you know, Trump remains really unpopular with Democratic voters.
I have a theory which may be proved astoundingly wrong, that at this point, Trump actually resents the 7 months he spent on health care, thinks it was a huge waste of his time. And even though he publicly supports this new Republican effort on health care, that's not where he wants things to go. He wants things to go to tax reform and then infrastructure. And actually, if they don't force through an Obamacare repeal, Democrats are going to be much more amenable on tax reform to saying, okay, I'll give you this, you give me that. By the way, we keep talking about tax reform. What do you think it's going to look like?
Yeah.
Because there's a huge fight inside the Republican Party. I mean, there are the people who want to do a Reagan-like tax cut, which, based on supply side theory, doesn't worry about the deficit and offsetting the tax cuts. And then there are the very conservative Freedom Caucus people who say, we have to offset every dime of a tax cut, which I think is virtually impossible at this point.
Yeah, so there's kind of two questions there. I do think that Trump now believes starting with healthcare was a mistake. And look, he doesn't sort of like overanalyze these things. I mean, it didn't work, it didn't pass. So sort of on its face, it wasn't a good idea. At the time, he wasn't in a position to sort of persuade leaders on Capitol Hill that tax reform was better first than healthcare. I mean, I think they thought it was a lighter lift than it was going to be. I think they thought they could move it more quickly. I think they thought there'd be more unity than there was. I think they didn't understand the opposition to repealing and replacing Obamacare that was going to spring up around the country.
That they actually made what had been an unpopular program popular as people began to worry about what they were going to lose.
Right, and the other thing is, listen, I mean, if you think about it, you step back, I mean, healthcare is it's Democratic territory. Right? I would argue that tax reform is much more Republican territory generally. And so Republicans were sort of fighting on their territory, trying to take an entitlement away from some people. It was clearly not going to cover more people right away. And it scored very badly. So it was just a really difficult situation. And it chewed up so much time, and it divided the party, and it frustrated Trump, obviously. Look at tax reform, it's different, right? Because it's actually an issue that he does understand, really, the substance and the details of. I truly believe that. And he has, I think, a team around him, an economic team around him that understands it very well and has credibility as well. So, and I think he's very excited about tax reform. I think it's been sold to him as a parallel to Reagan. And the last time we had a major tax reform was 1986 with the Reagan tax cuts. And so I think that we are going to have, look, it troubles me that we're sitting here on September 14th with 25 or so legislative days left and we still don't have a tax reform bill, because it's going to be very hard to do anything as soon as the clock hits 12:01 on January 1st, 2018, because we're going to be in a re-election year for all the members of the House and a third of the Senate. So they've got, I've been saying recently, Bob, that they've got 3.5 months to do 12 months worth of work, and the House is now going out for 10 days after being in for 1 week. So tax reform, I think, is ultimately going to do a few things. I think, number one, you're going to see the corporate tax rate reduced considerably. We have the highest corporate tax rate in the world. Japan lowered theirs. We used to have a lower rate than theirs, but we're now the highest in the world. I think they're going to try to get to 15%. My guess is they can't get there to make it all work. Because again, since they're using reconciliation, this is the key thing to understand. They can't do the biggest tax cut ever because it would cause deficits to rise, at least in the short term. They have to do something that's revenue neutral over a 10-year period.
Or they have to do a deal with Democrats.
Or they have to do a deal with
Which is what Reagan did with Bill Bradley, Kennedy, Gephardt. I mean,
right. And right now they're planning, I think, on going more of a partisan route because they're using reconciliation. They don't necessarily have to have Democratic votes. Now that may change. But number one, I think they're going to reduce the corporate tax rate. They're going to, I think, double the standard deduction, which is something that most middle class and lower class people use. I think they're going to get rid of a number of the deductions. This is also known as sort of broadening the base, which allows you to lower rates if you get rid of those deductions. There's going to be a lot of pressure on them to keep mortgage interest deduction and charitable deductions. My guess is that those two will be saved, but everything else may go by the wayside or may be limited.
Tax deductions would go.
I mean, that's going to be unpopular in states that have higher state taxes than other states because they don't have an income tax. Texas would be one of them. Florida would be one of them.
In Texas, you have very high property taxes.
We do.
And people deduct those.
Yeah.
I had a Republican consultant out here say to me, look, they think they're just punishing the blue states if they do this. Paul Ryan wants to. We're going to lose 4 or 5 congressional seats in this state if we get rid of state and local tax deductions.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is you have to see how it all balances out, right? If you take that deduction out, but if a person's rate goes down, it's hard to know exactly how the average person would fare. Look, I think that the goal here is President Obama was the first president in American history not to have 1 year of 3% annual economic growth. He had quarters that were above 3%, but not 1 year that was above 3% economic growth. That's very unusual after a recession. If you go back through history, when we have contractions, when the economy contracts, we usually almost always have explosive economic growth afterwards. You saw that in the 70s. You saw that in the Great Depression. And that's mostly because the economy becomes far more efficient, and you have pent-up demand, and that all starts working. You didn't have that in the Obama years. You did have the economy grow, you did have job creation, you had some good things, but you didn't have that. And so I think Trump and his economic team really want to get to a baseline of 3% economic growth. They believe tax reform will do that. They're going to use a reduction on repatriated profits overseas, which is going to bring $2 or $3 trillion that's parked overseas back here, get it invested in the economy. And I think the most important thing, Bob, which Reagan did as well, is I think they're going to make the tax cuts retroactive, which means the moment it passes, it can affect that year. So if they do it before December 31st, it could apply to this year. So people could feel a benefit right away.
By the way, California will be a very expensive state to live in if the Paul Ryan version of tax reform goes through. I'm going to stop. I'm going to turn this over to you guys. Anybody want to ask a question?
Don't be shy. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tarek. I'm a senior.
Hey.
I wanted to ask, because both you and Professor Strong have backgrounds in strategy.
Yeah.
With everything that you guys mentioned that's going on with Trump being undisciplined, kind of not knowing what the job entails, and Republicans being very split on how they feel about him, is the strategic atmosphere the same as it used to be? Because I mean, as a 21-year-old college student, I have no idea what it was like. When I'm looking at the news right now, everything looks like it's all over the place.
Yeah.
People are saying very conflicting things. So right now, both on the Democratic and the Republican side, do Republicans have a strategic arc, or is it more, I guess, diffuse than it used to be?
Man, that's a really good question, and I feel like we take an hour just talking about that. I mean, I think there's a couple of factors that are playing into all of this. I think number one, I think you have this sort of new media world we're living in that's changed things considerably, right? We now have far more information at our fingertips. Things are disseminated immediately. It's affecting the ability of people to negotiate privately, the ability of coalitions to build on issues, the ability of people to try to fight things legislatively, makes it very hard to do things. So that is a huge factor that's changing, I think, a lot of how you address things strategically. It used to be you could try to focus on, the evening news on the 3 networks was basically the only way you needed to be communicating to people, or perhaps in the major newspapers in print. Today, I mean, that audience is shrinking every single day. But the second thing I think that's a factor is polarization. The country's more polarized now than it used to be. I still do believe there is, 60 or 65% of the country that is generally between the 40-yard lines ideologically. It's maybe fiscally conservative, socially moderate, or socially liberal. They're sort of in the middle. Republicans have 20%, 25%. Democrats have 25%. But polarization. The issue right now is most members of Congress are not vulnerable in general elections. They're more vulnerable in primaries than they are in general elections. And so, if you're an elected official and you're trying to think about how do I stay where I am, how do I continue to gain power, gain influence, have a better opportunity to do the things I came here to do, you have to get reelected to do that, right? And so you look at it and you say, what is the biggest threat to me staying here? And right now, the biggest threat for a lot of these folks is a primary, not a general election. And so what does that do? It pushes them out, right, to each side. And so the further the sides are, the harder it is for them to come back together and do big bipartisan deals. So, look, I mean, what's so unusual about Trump is, generally when we have a president, they're sort of within the mainstream of the party that elected them. They agree with 80, 90% of what their party stands for. The members of the party in the Congress and the White House all have general agreement. They may have a disagreement on something here or there that's fundamental, but they have a lot of agreement. Trump's platform was his platform. It was not the Republican Party platform. Republicans didn't run on renegotiating NAFTA. They didn't run on better relations with Russia. No, I don't know. I mean, maybe Dana Rohrabacher did, but other than him, no one else has run on better relations with Russia. Our party is not an isolationist party. Rand Paul has that view, but there's not a lot of people that have an isolationist view. So that's what's so interesting about Trump, is that he has kind of this hold on Republican voters right now, but he doesn't have a hold on Republican elected officials. But they're I think, handcuffed because of the support he has among Republican voters. But because he has this sort of non-ideological way he approaches issues, it's kind of like nothing's possible, but everything's possible right now. And so I just have never seen a moment like this where no one knows where this is headed. I mean, he could still find ways to be very effective legislatively and get big things done, make people feel better about the direction of the country, have his image be repaired over time. or this could all fall apart any time here.
I think myself that the Republican strategic arc right now is survival.
Yeah.
Through 2018,
Yep.
seeing what happens in 2020, and I think the Democratic strategic arc is deciding who they are, and there's this completely ridiculous fight between people who say you either have to be for social justice or for economic justice. And the truth is, the Democratic Party is not going to go forward in any credible way unless it's for both. That's my view. Another question? Yeah.
I'm Michelle, I'm a freshman.
Hi.
I was wondering, I totally agree with you that he started off very poorly, not unifying the country in his inaugural address. Do you believe that he ever really had a chance to unify the country because how divided we were over the election? Do you think he had that chance and he missed it, or do you think that we were never going to give him that chance?
It's a great question, and listen, part of this is like we sit here and we analyze this and we sort of think about Trump in conventional ways when he's very unconventional and he's very limited, right? He's not capable of doing everything we think he may be able to do. He's 70 years old, he's not changing, he is who he is. And so part of this is a lot of times we sort of apply analysis and strategy to him in a way that's not realistic. That said, you would think that he would have been sober enough to realize when he got elected the country was very divided. It was a very narrow election. There was obviously tremendous anger about Russia's involvement. Democrats, to some extent, feel like the election was stolen. Trump didn't have a mandate. He had 46% of the votes. He had a majority of the country that voted against him. To me, I think the original sin or the original mistake maybe that he made was that he kind of went with that nationalist agenda from the very beginning that was never going to be unifying. It was a great way to sort of play to his base, to deliver for them, to keep that 35% fully behind him, but it was not a way to grow. And so, I'm a pretty sharp critic of the Steve Bannon kind of worldview and approach. And so that started with the inaugural address. If that address had been more unifying, I think that might have at least offered him a chance to recast himself if he had reached out to Hillary in a more meaningful way. I mean, I thought it was a good thing that they announced early on they weren't going to pursue criminal charges against her. That's just not what we do in the United States. We don't punish political enemies after an election. So I think that's at least a positive thing. I actually thought it might have been a good idea if he pardoned her, just to put all of it behind him. But I'm sure Democrats might have seen that as some type of negative thing. So, look, I think that
Bill Clinton's first line, or it might have been the second,
yeah.
his inaugural address,
yeah.
was first, let me thank President Bush for all he has done over so many years for our country.
Yeah.
A totally different tone.
Yeah.
Whereas if you look at the inaugural address of Trump, he's got Jimmy Carter sitting there. He's got George Bush sitting there. He's got Bill Clinton sitting there. He's got Hillary Clinton sitting there. And he basically says, all of the last 5 presidencies were trash. I mean, it's an extraordinary moment.
No, he was like pretty explicitly insulting.
George Bush, W. Bush, was pulling the rain thing over his head. I mean,
yeah.
It was amazing.
Yeah.
More questions.
I wanted to ask you about how Trump's handling of Jeff Sessions in the past couple of months has kind of revealed things about his personality. Because, for a time there, he was, executing a very pointed attack on Jeff Sessions publicly.
Yeah.
And, a lot of other people exited the administration.
Did you see the New York Times story this afternoon? They had the inside story of how Trump treated Sessions in the Oval.
Oh, yeah, I saw it came out. I hadn't read it.
An idiot.
Yeah.
Swore at him, demanded his resignation. He did resign. Trump was then talked out of accepting the resignation.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, listen, there are so many things about this presidency 9 months in that are unprecedented. And one of them is seeing a president sort of publicly embarrass and attack and lambast one of his cabinet secretaries. Generally, these things happen in private. I mean, it happens fairly regularly that a president decides a cabinet member needs to go do something else. And usually it's the White House Chief of Staff that asks them for a letter of resignation, they give it, and it's over. In this case, I think President Trump, he obviously knows more about the Mueller investigation based on what his lawyers know, what they're being asked for, and who's having to answer questions. So he knows more earlier about all this than we do, and he's obviously feeling that pressure personally. in ways that we can't be aware of. And so I think that reached a tipping point here 2 months ago or so, and he's still very angry about the decision to recuse. To me, it was a no-brainer. Sessions had to recuse. You know, if Trump was
It'd be a violation of federal law if he didn't.
absolutely, and honestly, if they were worried about that, then they should have appointed someone who wasn't involved in the campaign. You know, appoint a retired judge. Look, this is another thing about Trump, and sometimes you have to, you know, is it that he doesn't know these things because he's just not familiar with it, or is there some kind of more sinister purpose behind it? I don't think he understands the Attorney General is not like the Small Business Administration, head. It is a very unique job in the cabinet because you are really meant to be entirely independent. You're the country's top law enforcement officer. You're there to execute the law, and it's really important that you have that degree of independence. And oftentimes, and Bob, no, you know through history, attorneys general oftentimes frustrate presidents because they don't necessarily always have to do everything the president wants in all cases.
Janet Reno frustrated Bill Clinton.
Absolutely.
She appointed a special prosecutor in Whitewater.
Absolutely. And so, look, keep in mind, whatever was going on with Russia, there was an opportunity for that to not happen, and whoever let that happen made decisions that had ramifications. You go beyond that, look, Trump made a terrible, indefensible, ridiculous decision to fire Jim Comey. And in fact, we wouldn't have a special counsel today had he not done that. That has nothing to do with Jeff Sessions choosing to recuse himself. Now, I also think because Kelly was brought in as chief of staff, because he'd been a cabinet secretary himself, because he has discipline and is honestly one of the 5 or 10 most decorated and honorable generals of his generation, I think he now has put more discipline into the administration. The cabinet feels more confident. Trump has actually been better behaved the last month or so. Honestly, he really has. I think that's made a difference. I think there's more discipline, more focus. I think he's not getting as much of this BS stuff on his desk from InfoWars and Breitbart and stuff like that. The paper flow is important.
Do you all know who Omarosa is, who was a contestant on The Apprentice? And she's in the White House special assistant. She had unfettered access, apparently, to the Oval Office, and she was taking stuff from InfoWars and Breitbart and bringing it into the president and saying, "Did you see this?" And then he'd fire off a tweet.
Yeah.
And she's now not allowed to go into the Oval Office without seeing General Kelly, whose answer apparently is almost invariably no.
Yeah, I mean, you finally have, look, Ryan Priebus is a friend of mine. Ultimately, I think he was not empowered to be the kind of chief of staff Trump needed. He didn't have the respect of some of the other senior staff. They all kind of felt they could do whatever they wanted and kind of run over him. And so I think history probably would be a little bit unkind to Reince because the first 7 months of the administration were chaotic. Probably shouldn't have taken the job. But listen, you get offered that job, that's a very unique job. You get offered White House press secretary or White House chief of staff, it's very hard to say no. Those are life-changing opportunities that come around once and never again. But I think Kelly is now empowered. I think Trump respects him. I think he's clearly has discipline. I think he's coming at it with a fresh set of eyes. And one of the first things he did was evaluate the staff. They've had some people leave. Thankfully, he got rid of Scaramucci, which was ridiculous in the first place. So again, I think things are becoming more normal within the realm of what's possible with this very unorthodox president. But we'll have to see where it goes.
You had a question.
Yeah.
And we're getting near the end.
I have 2 questions. Okay, so how likely is it for Trump to get impeached, and what would a Mike Pence administration look like?
Okay, so the first question is how likely could he be impeached? So obviously, it's going to depend a lot on how the Mueller investigation ends. What evidence is he presenting? Where's that headed? And who's involved? I think the likelihood of him being impeached, if the Democrats take back the Congress, is very high. Keep in mind, impeachment is not a legal matter. It's a political matter, right? And part of this, too, is going to be what are the articles of impeachment going to be if the Democrats do that? What are they truly impeaching him for, and are they able to make a case to the public? You know, the impeachment of Clinton ended up being unpopular. He got through that.
And the Democrats did far better in '98 in the midterm election.
That's right.
In part because the Republicans were impeaching the president on grounds that the country Or they might have found what Clinton did distasteful.
Right.
The Republicans so politicized if there was a rebellion against it.
So the Democrats, the Republicans overreached at that time. And there's a risk perhaps the Democrats could overreach, depending on the substance of it. So, but look, this is a mortal threat, a real risk to Trump's presidency. And it's part of why they need to be very wary of the midterm elections. I think Republicans on Capitol Hill are much more wary of the midterms than Trump is. What would a Pence administration look like? Look, I think Pence has been a very loyal number two. I don't have any doubt that he's uncomfortable with things that are happening up there. And he is about as old school as it gets, as traditional as it gets. There's a lot of things he's probably not comfortable with, but he understands that as Vice President of the United States, you can be critical in private, one-on-one, but you have to support the president. And he's done that really without any limitation. I think his presidency would be far more traditional and far more kind of orthodox. The question would be, would he continue with this sort of nationalistic, populistic agenda that Trump ran on and that he got elected with him on, or would he go in more of a traditional Republican direction? I think what you'd see is it would probably be a bit more partisan, a bit less bipartisan, perhaps. Pence was in leadership in the House. He's a solid conservative, understands conservatism. He's very disciplined. I think he could have a very successful presidency. It would depend a lot on the circumstance, though. Following someone who is impeached would obviously be a very, very difficult situation.
Okay, normally at the end of these, I thank our guests. These political conversations, we're gonna do something a little different today. It was Matt's birthday. So, happy birthday.
All right, thank
We didn't
you.
bring a whole cake.
Thank you. No singing, I
We
hope.
got a really, really good cupcake.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank
This
you.
was terrific and enlightening.
Thank you. Good luck, y'all.